I can't believe it's already April already, and yet another month has passed by. I'm sorry I'm super late for this video, but I've been very busy as of recently. Last week I went to New York City, and I have actually been working on another short film, but better late than never, I always say. Without further ado, I started the month off with Steven Spielberg's Catch Me If You Can, and even though a lot of the events presented here are heavily embellished and not really true to what really happened, this was still an incredibly solid film. This film takes place during the 60s, and I feel that this film actually managed to pay homage to that decade quite well. The cinematography here is also really solid, and Leo gives a surprisingly heartfelt performance. During the third act especially, I really found myself deeply caring for Leo's character. This film does a pretty good job in making the audience feel a lot of sympathy for Frank Abagnale. Though I feel that this film did kind of overstay its welcome. I feel like about 20 minutes before this film ended, it kind of crescendoed, and I feel like that it didn't really land the plane at the end. I felt like that the last 20 minutes could have been a lot more concise, and it really would have improved the film's pacing by a lot. But anyways, I think that this is honestly one of the better Spielberg movies of the 2000s. After watching Catch Me If You Can, I wanted to watch a film that was set during that era, and I couldn't think of a single film that could have fit that description better. This film is the perfect time capsule of the counterculture movement. Yes, I'm aware that there are no hippies present here, but it perfectly encapsulated the overall divide amongst the younger and older generations. I really adored this film. Benjamin's quest to find meaning to his life was actually kind of relatable for me, despite of how predatory he got during the third act of this film. The idea of being in your 20s, kind of feeling overwhelmed by the pressures of society, and feeling kind of lost in life, and not really knowing where to go, is something that I feel that speaks to most young people. I really love this film's soundtrack by Simon and Garfunkel. I loved it so much that I actually picked up the vinyl. Now, I think that they play the song Scarborough Fair a little too much, but I can't really complain since I really like that song. Though I love this film's ending. I think it is actually nearly perfect. It perfectly encapsulates the main themes of this film. This film has perfect pacing. From the very beginning, the stakes were set up, and from that moment forward, I was hooked. This is impressive because this film practically takes place in just one room, and this film is able to use that limitation to its advantage. The claustrophobia and extreme heat was captured really well in this scene, making the overall hostility feel so much more believable, and the scene with the knife was actually incredible. I audibly gasped, and I almost never do that. This wasn't exactly my cup of tea. I mean, it wasn't the worst thing I've ever seen, but I am far from being the target audience for this. I enjoyed some of the songs, but I didn't really take away much from this. The ending was oh so pretty bad. Just an overall complete rejection of any form of logic. And Pierce Brosnan can't sing. I certainly admired the craft that was on display here. This is the textbook definition of a well-made film. Cinematography was on point, and the performances were immaculate, especially Daniel Day-Lewis. I just wish I cared a little more about the story. Because of this, I kind of felt that this film was a bit of a chore to get through. I mean, my opinion could change on rewatch, as it often has, but currently, I don't love it as much as most really seem to. full review is up on my channel. This film, of course, kicked off the most successful movie franchise of all time. But more importantly, this is just a really well-made movie. I love how this film fully focuses on crafting a good story first, and leaving all the setup for the greater cinematic universe secondary. The character arc of our main protagonist, Tony Stark, is believable and is able to be communicated in a rather concise manner. This film does kind of drop the ball a little bit during the third act with its twist villain, but it manages to land the ship quite well with its incredible final scene. This film kind of surprised me. I was worried that this film would be unnecessary, since Creed 2 kind of ended on a rather conclusive note for Adonis Creed. Sylvester Stallone not returning definitely bummed me out, and this film did feel a little empty without him, but this film managed to go on without him quite well. This film did manage to justify its existence by telling a heartbreaking story about long-lost friendship. Even though we had never heard of Damien in any of the previous films, I was still able to buy his relationship with Adonis and the reasons for their eventual falling out. This film actually does a really good job in explaining why Damien wasn't mentioned in any of the previous films. It's like that Adonis tried to hide that chapter of his life away from his loved ones and the audience, honestly. This film was the first Creed film to be directed by Michael B. Jordan himself, and he directed the absolute hell out of this film. He managed to take the final fight scene, which usually looks the same, and change up the formula a little bit. I was pretty confused when he said that this film would be inspired by anime, and I acknowledge that hearing that sounds kind of silly, but finally seeing this film, that statement kind of makes sense. I'm open to the idea of Creed 4, and it's practically confirmed at this point, I imagine, but if they ended it here, I would be more than satisfied. Birdman is successfully able to justify its existence more than its gimmick of being a one-shot film. This film is able to use that gimmick to its advantage, making the story feel a lot more organic and at times very chaotic. This is by far Michael Keaton's best performance. It was honestly genius casting him as Birdman, since in real life he played Batman, and watching his performance in this film is kind of like watching the real Michael Keaton go through an extreme existential crisis. Due to the circumstances of me being able to connect Birdman to Batman, I'm able to buy Michael Keaton's performance a lot more. Honestly, this film holds up a lot more 9 years later. I watched this film on Pi Day, and unfortunately I didn't catch the remaster of this film. I'm super envious of those who were able to. This might be a hot take, but this film might be my favorite Aronofsky film. It's dark and disturbing enough to get under your skin, but unlike Requiem for a Dream, I actually see myself watching this again. I really enjoyed the scrappy, homemade feel of this film. The high contrast 16mm black and white really works for me. This is able to fully communicate the OCD-like stress that Max is constantly under, and just the chaos of his surroundings as seen in his apartment. Max is fully convinced that he is on the verge of discovering the mathematical equation that will reveal the patterns in nature, I guess. This obsession of being able to practically become a god amongst men due to being able to crack life's greatest mystery literally drives him insane. And I really loved Max's character arc in this film. Because of this film, I watched a lot of scrappy, low-budget directorial debuts, as you will see later. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man is a film that I never grow sick of. I watched this literally every single day as a child, and I'm able to rewatch this as an adult and still fully appreciate it. This film is just so unashamedly campy, but at the same time, it takes its characters seriously. This is actually an extremely accurate adaptation of these characters as seen in the comics from the 60s and 70s, and it manages to nail that tone quite well. Yes, there are some aspects of this film that are a little too silly for me, like the Green Goblin's costume and some of his dialogue. But this film isn't afraid to get brutal. The final fight, for example, is one of my favorite fight scenes in all of movies. I mean, I have trouble even calling it a fight scene. I think beatdown is more accurate here. It is so rare to see our main protagonist in one of these movies to be in such a vulnerable spot. I just love how emotionally mature this last scene is, and that word's gonna get thrown around a lot. The stakes here are actually relatively low compared to more modern comic book movies. There's no city, world, even multiverse ending threat present here. It's very clear that our villain is about to kill our main character, and I am able to buy this threat a lot more than the large, big-scale threats in modern comic book movies, just by the sheer brutality of this scene. And I think the simplicity of that is missing in comic book movies today. I believe that superhero fatigue is a real thing, but I will never grow tired of this film. This film took everything the first film did right, and it manages to do all those same things, but better. This film doubles down on Peter's conflict, his struggle with his dual life. This film is honestly a big-budget comic book movie disguised as a character study. In fact, I don't think you can find a better character study in the comic book movie genre. This film asks the question if Peter's dual life, his responsibility as Spider-Man, is too heavy of a burden for him to carry. In fact, for most of this film, the answer to that question would be a resounding yes. To say that Peter's emotional well-being was taking a backseat due to his responsibility as Spider-Man would be quite the understatement. This is one of my favorite comic book movies ever made. Honestly, this is probably my favorite comic book movie ever made, period, next to The Dark Knight. Also, the train scene is not only one of my favorite action scenes from the comic book movie genre, it is just one of my favorite action scenes, period. The fight choreography is just able to perfectly capture Spidey's abilities and how he is just able to perfectly dodge attacks from just a moment's notice. But the reason why this scene works for me is just how emotionally mature the conclusion is. The main reason why I love this scene so much is how it concludes. I just love how emotionally mature the ending to this scene is, showing the power of selflessness and kindness. Yes, I might be blinded by nostalgia here, but this isn't only one of my favorite comic book movies, it's just one of my favorite movies in general. There is actually a lot to like here, but compared to the first two installments, this film is quite a letdown. This film is infamously just a giant mess of ideas, and in that mess are some actually pretty good ideas, but narratively and structurally, this film is all over the place. Characters and plot lines are written in and out of the plot, and most of the time based on sheer convenience. When this film does focus on the aspects I enjoy, this is actually kind of a solid film. I thoroughly enjoy everything involving Sandman. Yes, I don't exactly love the retconning of Uncle Ben's death, but I really love Peter's character arc through this character. It is honestly so fascinating to see Peter Parker, a good-hearted person, just fall deep into the depths of vengeance and growing a bloodlust for Sandman. All of this kind of culminates in the subway fight scene, which is actually quite underrated. I even enjoy Peter's relationship with the black suit. I love how this film frames the symbiote as a drug. Like, at first he initially rejects it because of the negative consequences that came with wearing the black suit, but when times got tough, he went back to it, almost like he withdrawed from the drug and fell even deeper into the darkness. And I really don't mind Bully Maguire. In fact, I find the scene with him dancing down the streets absolutely hilarious. I probably find it funny in a more ironic way, but I'm entirely grateful that this scene exists. This film really falls apart during the third act for me. Topher Grace as Eddie Brock was just terrible casting. I know I'm not the first person to say this, but I think that this is the worst aspect of this film. His performance is just so cringeworthy, and his conflict with Peter just seemed so much pettier than all the other conflicts in this film. I also really hate how Harry's butler just comes in and decides now to tell Harry the truth about his father. Like, he really should have done that 2 movies ago, but it did create this hilarious blooper.
The blade that pierced his body came from his gilder.
Though I really enjoyed the juxtaposition between Harry's death and Norman's death. I know I've been talking way too long about this one movie, but my feelings are just so complicated. This is the only documentary I watched this month, and it deals with some pretty heavy subject matter, which is the slow and heartbreaking process of losing a parent to dementia. But it manages to deal with this extremely upsetting topic in a rather lighthearted way. Yes, at times the humor did feel a little jarring, but it is very clear to the audience that this is the way that the director, Kirsten Johnson, is dealing with the slow decline of her father, and that is with humor. I'm aware that this might not be for everyone, but I thought this was a pretty touching documentary, all things considered. I had a blast with Evil Dead 2, and I actually preferred it to the original. I really enjoyed how scrappy the original felt, but I felt like that this was able to retain Sam Raimi's style, but on a higher budget. And I feel like that his style is a lot more polished here than it was in the first one. In fact, Sam Raimi was given more creative control because of the high budget due to the fact that he was free of a lot of the financial limitations that he faced during the first one. This film also has some of the best practical effects ever put to film. Honestly, the 80s was kind of the peak of practical effects. You know, it was before CGI and the digital age, and technology for practical effects was at its height at this time. And then after this point, you know, practical effects were obviously abandoned due to the rise of CGI. I feel like elaborate practical effects are kind of a lost art form these days. This film does kind of dabble with what seems to be digital effects, and this film kind of shows its age during these scenes. This is especially present in this film's ending. But other than that, this film was a blast from beginning to end. Full review is up on my channel. As many of you probably know, this was the only film in Stanley Kubrick's filmography where he didn't have complete creative control over the film. In fact, this was kind of his only for-hire gig, and it was his experience with this film that kind of motivated him to demand for complete creative control in his feature films. Narratively, this film is completely different from your standard Stanley Kubrick affair, but I feel like it works as a historical epic. Yes, I wish Kubrick got his wish in making Spartacus a more flawed hero. I feel like that this would have made his character a lot more interesting. Though the one aspect that Kubrick had some control over was the cinematography, and you can tell, the cinematography here is absolutely breathtaking. This is definitely one of Kubrick's weaker films, but it is far from being terrible. This was a pretty safe and inoffensive film. That's honestly all I have to say here. This film doesn't do anything terribly wrong, but at the same time, this film doesn't really do anything that noteworthy other than featuring the voice talents of the great Kevin Conroy. This film was perfectly watchable, and if you're in the mood for a great Bruce Timm-style animated Batman movie, I would go with something like Mask of the Phantasm, or even Sub-Zero. But if you've already seen those films, and you just want to scratch that itch for watching a Bruce Timm animated Batman movie, there's worse ways you can spend your 80 minutes, honestly. This is one of my favorite comedies to come out in recent times. It's able to take an incredibly crass concept about a young boy and his imaginary Hitler friend and execute it in a mature and tasteful way. It's got all the laughs, and most importantly, a really powerful character arc. This film does a really solid job in balancing comedy and drama. It's honestly a little surprising that this guy would later make Love and Thunder. The making of this film is absolutely inspiring. It was made with the tiny budget of around $7,000, which sounds like it's a lot of money, but in filmmaking terms, this is next to nothing. Apparently, Robert Rodriguez got that money by consenting to strange medical experiments for about a month. After that, he got paid his $7,000 and he made this. With all the budgetary limitations setting him back, Robert Rodriguez still made a really solid film. I was surprised how quickly I was able to care about our main character and his quest to be able to escape trouble and to be able to play the mariachi in peace. Honestly, any person who has tried to do anything creative can relate to the narrative that the world is out to get them, that everything is stacked up against them, and they are just unable to complete their vision due to all these just circumstances that just come out of nowhere. This film obviously takes that to the extreme, with our main character's life being in constant danger. Since this film was made on a low budget and they couldn't really find professional actors, some of the acting here is pretty rough. But other than that, this is an incredibly solid film, and just the making behind it inspires me so much. I finished the month off with Richard Linklater's Slacker. This film truly revolutionized the slice of life genre and brought those films back into the forefront. I love Richard Linklater's dialogue. Some may find it pretentious, but I find his dialogue actually very human. I love watching his films and feeling like a fly on the wall and listening in on these kind of pretentious but very intriguing conversations. Though I feel Linklater would later perfect this style in Before Sunrise, and obviously the rest of the films in the Before trilogy. In this film, when you get attached to a character, it kind of jumps on to the next character, while in the Before trilogy, you have 3 films to get attached to these 2 characters. Yes, I know that this is an unfair comparison, but this film doesn't really give you time to get attached to any of these characters because it's so quick to jumping on to the next character. I am willing to admire and respect the concept of this film. I mean, it is an incredibly interesting concept, and I respect the hell out of this film because this film walked, so the Before trilogy can run. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed my latest video, and if you did, make sure to give this video a like. And if you want more content like this, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell notification so you can be notified every time I upload a new video. And shout out to the Sega Dreamcast and Olivia Rodrigo. Thanks for watching.